As an archaeologist, I often wonder how language change over time has affected the evolution of the stories and beliefs that have arrived in the present format we find them today. How do we know what we believe is actually the belief that was written or orally communicated by our ancient ancestors? How do we dig into the ancient mind when we may not even know the words they spoke? Take, for example, the Temple period, the late Neolithic, on the island of Malta in the central Mediterranean. They built magnificent megalithic temples, but we have no written language representing this culture, nor do we know anything about their language they spoke. However, we have symbols that they have left behind found on pottery and on the walls of their temples. Depicted in this slide are some pictures from the temples found on the island of Malta. These ancient societies have shaped our present, and the stories they told ultimately have evolved, and the elements of their beliefs migrated into the present stories we may subscribe to today. But the question is, the stories that we have today, were they the original beliefs of our ancient ancestors? And if they were not, what does that mean with regard to our understanding of these stories and how we internalize them? And how does that redefine our culture, if at all? Hopefully, you read the article, The Shapiro-Whorf Hypothesis, today, because now I will look at this article in more detail with you. Basil Hussein briefly introduces the Shapiro-Whorf hypothesis within the background of its origins and the thoughts of Humboldt's philosophy of language, and states, if language forms ideas, it also plays a role in shaping the attitudes of individuals. Hence, individuals speaking different languages must have different worldviews. Considering this statement, I ask myself the question, what about South America? Besides Brazil, where Portuguese is the official language, countries in South America share in speaking Spanish. However, the people of Peru have a different cultural background compared to the people in Argentina. Therefore, I wonder how much of the geography, ecology, and history preceding the introduction of Spanish into the area has in shaping the way the language was adopted, creating the nuances and differences we see in various communities throughout South America. Further, how do we know what we know about the reality of the world we find ourselves? Martin Heidegger, a German philosopher, came up with the concept, the thingness of the thing. Essentially, the essence of something is found within the thing itself. If that is true, how do two people who speak different languages come upon the same thing and perceive its reality, its existence, the essence of what it really is? Can these two people come to a similar understanding? Or is the language difference between the two individuals truly creating a barrier in how the two internalize the exact same object or experience? Edward Sapir would say, as pointed out in the article, language shapes the way we perceive the world. And the existence of different language systems implies people who think in these languages perceive the world differently. Therefore, according to Sapir, the two individuals I mentioned would ultimately see the same object, its essence, differently. However, is that perception difference significant or negligible in reality? And what about people who share the same language? Is it possible that people who speak the same language perceive reality different because the words may have different meanings, even if slight, from one group of people within the same language compared to another group of people who share that same exact language? Take, for example, Americans and the British. We all speak English, but do we really see the world the same way? And how is our cultures different? Does geography play a role in shaping the symbolic meanings in the words we share? Ultimately, people living in the United States have a different history than those in Great Britain. We have other influences, including First Nations people and the diversity of immigrants who have all shaped who we are today as a society. This cultural history in America is definitely not the same cultural history found in Great Britain. The two countries have evolved in different trajectories. As noted in the article, Shapiro understood the relationship between language and culture and came to the conclusion that one cannot truly understand another culture without having an understanding of the language of that culture. As mentioned in the lecture outline, Benjamin Whorf was a student of Shapiro. Whorf began to formulate his ideas within linguistic relativity as a fire prevention inspector for the Hartford Fire Insurance Company, and later as a student of Shapiro working with the Hopi language in New Mexico. Whorf found that English speakers used words full and empty to describe the quality of what was in gasoline drums to mean the liquid alone. Therefore, those who worked around gasoline drums would smoke by them, thinking that the gasoline drums were empty when they no longer had any gasoline in them. However, the drums were not actually empty. The drums were still full of gas vapors. This obviously created risk that the insurance company was interested in ascertaining. Think, for example, about the question, do you think the glass is half full or half empty? The reality is it may be neither, because the space within the glass that does not have liquid is still occupied by the molecules within the air that is found within that space contained by the walls of the glass. But our perception of it is not full, even though the entirety of the space within the glass has content. It is this line of thinking that led Whorf to the conclusion that behavior is often influenced by language and how it shapes the way we think about things. The words that we have in the lexicon of our language influence the cognition in the way we process the reality of the universe that we are interacting with. The biggest impact on Whorf's ideas about language came from his studies comparing the Hopi language with English, French, and German. He noted that English, French, and German shared many structural similarities and classified these features as Standard Average European, or SAE. He compared the standard or similar features of the European languages with the Hopi language and found Hopi and Standard Average European differed in structural characteristics. This was clearly demonstrated with regard to the conceptualization of time. Standard Average European languages had a fixed orientation toward time and space. This meant that Europeans objectify reality in different ways and distinguish between things that must be counted. For example, in SAE, events occur, have occurred, or will occur in a definite time, space, past, present, and future. However, the Hopi see the world and time as an ongoing set of processes, sort of one continuous fluid river merging the past, present, and future together. The Hopi language does create the reality of discrete differences, as with the European languages. However, their perception of time allows for this fluidity or this conceptualization of our reality to be all existing within the same dimensional space. Therefore, this ultimately shapes the differences observed in the perceptions of reality between the Europeans and the Hopi. And these different perceptions have an effect on cultural development, history, and evolution for each of these groups. However, as the article points out, Franz Boas noted that there was no nexus between language and culture, or should I say, he took issue with the idea that language ultimately defines or shapes our reality by saying that there was no link between language and culture. He observed examples of people who speak languages with very different structures sharing similar cultural practices and beliefs. For example, religion. The Islamic culture can be found throughout the world, but Arabic Muslims speak with a different language structure than, say, Malaysian Muslims. However, it is interesting to note that in Islam, there is a tradition that the Quran should only be studied in Arabic. And many Muslims throughout the world learn the Quran in Arabic, even if their original language is different. Therefore, is language still shaping the reality of belief? What about changes over time? For example, there is differences between ancient Hebrew and modern Hebrew. How has the sacred texts of the Torah, the Old Testament, changed because of the differences between the two scripts? These questions raise many interesting challenges for scholars who study in the area of archaeology, history, religion, etc. Recently, there has been caution in the way we applied the Shapiro-Whorf hypothesis. For example, as the article notes, Helmut Gipper, a German linguist, takes a cautious approach to linguistic relativity. As he points out, that while language may influence our thinking process, he believes the fact that we are capable of initiating changes in our language and in our thinking habits, the quality of language influence over shaping our perceptions should not be looked at in terms of absolutes, but in terms of degrees. Therefore, language does not strictly determine our reality and can be influenced by other factors that bring about change within our in our words and the way we communicate. Therefore, changing our perceptions and culture over time. The bottom line is language influences us versus dictates the perceptions of our reality. Now, this leads me to some other questions or ideas to think about. Going back to the question, can we transcend language? How about numbers and mathematics? Are numbers universal? Is math universal? Researchers at SETI who try to listen for signals out in the universe to see if there is intelligent life elsewhere often look at patterns associated with repeated numbers. There's this idea that one of the best ways to communicate with civilizations in other places throughout the galaxy is through numbers and mathematics. For example, the binary code.